This is the Bruchim podcast, the only podcast in the world dedicated to Jews who think differently about circumcision. Welcome back to the Bruchim podcast. I'm your host, Eli Sargon, and joining me today from New Haven, Connecticut is our Director of Education at Bruchim, Max Duboff. Max, how are you on this fine morning?
Doing well. There's some beautiful snow out the window, and it's great to be talking about these issues.
And joining us from Manitoba, Canada is Jonathan Allan. Professor Allan is the Canada Research Chair in Men and Masculinities and professor in the Department of English, Drama and Creative Writing and Gender and Women's Studies at Brandon University. Dr. Allan is an editor for Journal of Bodies, Sexualities, and Masculinities, interim editor of Boyhood Studies, and vice president of the American Men's Studies Association. Professor Allan recently wrote a book called Uncut, a cultural analysis of the foreskin. Dr. Allan, it is a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining us on the Bruchim podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So you recently wrote this book, Uncut, a cultural analysis of the foreskin, and I want to get into it. But the first thing I have to mention, which really sort of jumped out at me, is you set out to write a book about the foreskin. And I think what you discovered very quickly is that it's difficult to talk about the foreskin without talking about circumcision. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. It's almost impossible. When I was writing it, I don't think I paid attention, but one of my readers did and said, you use the word circumcision more than foreskin. And all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, I've got to think this one through. And they gave great advice to color code the words. And it became very clear to me how these two concepts are just married to one another.
One of the things that I found most interesting about your book is the attempt to be able to talk about the foreskin and to think about the foreskin sort of on its own, not in relation to circumcision, but also in relation to circumcision. So can you maybe, to help get us started, say a bit more about how you think we can begin to talk more and think more about the foreskin itself?
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things, right, is when we think of the foreskin, we think of its removal. It's almost like we can just ignore it in a sense. You either have it or you don't have it, right? But if you do have it, what does it mean? What is its function, right? I mean, you're born with it. Why is it there? And so I was really interested in, like, how do we separate the foreskin and circumcision so that they can exist together, but in different ways. And so one of the things I tried to do was to think, well, what is a foreskin? Why does it matter? Why do we get excited about it? Why is it that in, say, American pop culture, we love to make jokes about it, right? It's ugly, or it's European, or something like this, right? So I wanted to think through the language and the discourse and the ideas about the foreskin, while still recognizing, of course, that circumcision's always lurking in the background.
It's fascinating to me also because I think you did your level best to draw a line around religious circumcision and put it off to one side and say, I'm not talking about religious circumcision. I'm just talking about secular circumcision. But even there, I think the sort of religious stuff started creeping into the project. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh, there's just no way around it. Because as soon as you start talking about circumcision, right away, people are saying, the Jewish tradition or something like this, right? Not recognizing, of course, that it's not just Jewish folks who do this, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to try to avoid was getting into a debate about religion versus secular versus, right? I wanted to say, I'm interested in the reasons why we circumcise when they're not religious, covenantal reasons. So the reasons that are so common, like I want my son to look like dad, or it's ugly, right? Or it's unhygienic, those sorts of reasons. Those were really interesting to me. If you are a religious person and you have a covenantal reason to circumcise, the reason for it is obvious. But when it's secular and it becomes about looking like dad or not being bullied in the locker room, those reasons become a bit more complicated, I think, or maybe nuanced.
So maybe as a way of digging into this question of religious and secular circumcision, I'm wondering how you think about the ways that Christian cultural norms play into American circumcision, right? Is there a sense in which the secular circumcision, so to speak, has some of these kinds of cultural religious overtones?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and I should foreground this by saying I am not a scholar of religion. What's interesting there is circumcision in the US has become, I think, as one scholar calls it, almost as American as apple pie. And so it becomes part of the cultural norms, which of course are caught up in Judeo-Christian values, right? But it's curious because Christianity doesn't require it. Right? The New Covenant baptism replaces circumcision, or Paul speaks of it doesn't matter if you're circumcised or uncircumcised. So it's interesting at how that has unfolded. And I would love to say it's easy to parse the religious and the secular, but it's not, right? And that's one of the things that haunts the book is you can't separate these. Even the ideas around circumcision that, it's Jewish as a tradition. Well, that's immediately is a cultural idea that's imposed through a religious model. And of course, it doesn't recognize, the complexity of circumcision in the Jewish traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that on our end, when we talk about Jewish circumcision, that's kind of our ballywick. One of the things that kind of stands out to us is that exactly what you just said, that we would, for the convenience of conceptual clarity, like to separate out Jewish and religious circumcision from secular circumcision. But I would say that especially in the United States today, it's impossible for two reasons. First of all of the psychological mechanisms that drive people to continue this practice have massive overlap with the secular version. And the second thing is that in the post-medicalization period, there's just a complete blurring of the line, including from the perspective of religious Jewish parents who are choosing to circumcise their children. And this process of medicalization that happens in the mid-20th century ends up infecting the Jewish community too in very interesting and instructive ways.
I don't know if you've had Jordan Osserman on. He wrote a book about circumcision on the couch, I think it's called. And he talks about, I think it's there, I hope I get this right, his own circumcision as a Jewish man, but his parents had a doctor do it, and a Jewish doctor, of course, to make sure that he was sort of doubly circumcised, I think is the language he uses, that it was ritual and medical.
So there you go. In one instance, you have just the epitome of how it's impossible to separate these things. I wonder if you could spend a little time talking about the process that you used in writing this book. It seems to me very like Walter Benjamin. You were sort of going into the popular culture, collecting different artifacts and trying to sort of squeeze them for meaning, if you will. Talk about your process and the sort of collective, the collection nature of how you went about this.
Yeah, so the original title for this book was just The Foreskin Archive. And it's kind of a horrible and academic and clunky title. But I liked the idea of collecting. So I collect everything that I can get my hands on. And so I started in 2015 or so thinking about this. And it was just sort of simple stuff. I would go to a museum, I would pay attention to the sculptures and say, oh, wow, look at all the foreskins. And then it became much more interesting when I started to think, well, there could be a book here. There could be something here. And I started collecting sex manuals, for instance. I collected pregnancy manuals. I collected books on parenting. I collected religious materials, magazines, newspaper articles. I've got objects in my offices. I have in my lab space what I call the Foreskin Archive. It's there now. And it's like banker's boxes just full of stuff because I am horribly addicted to collecting these things. And I wanted to find out as much as possible, right? Whether it's Sex in the City, right? Or it's The Big Bang Theory, or it's CNN, or it's, political talk. Whatever it was interesting to me.
Tabloid coverage of the royal foreskins. Yeah.
The royal foreskin, yes. And like Prince Harry coming out and saying that he was circumcised. And what's so interesting is there's so much information that Princess Di didn't want him to be circumcised. So you're almost like tempted to say Pixar, it didn't happen, right? In the sense that like, what's going on here? Like there's so much debate about it. And that became headline news, right? Like Prince Harry confirms he's circumcised. Whoa. Like, whoa, why is that even interesting or fascinating to us? But it was, and it was when he was born, right? There were like newspaper articles, and I think People magazine had stuff, Playboy probably, about the royal foreskins. It's fascinating.
And even just at the level of how we talk about this, you brought the insight in your book that I thought was spot on, which is that we talk about men who are cut and uncut, which automatically in the language sort of tips you off to the fact that this is going to be an identity issue. You don't talk about a man who has a circumcised penis. You talk about a circumcised man, right?
Oh, absolutely. You are cut or you are uncut or circumcised or uncircumcised. And that in itself is fascinating because you're right. It's not about like my penis is circumcised, my penis is uncircumcised. It's I as a person am uncut or cut. And that somehow it informs my entire identity. Like that is just wild. Right? Because if it's that influential that it becomes kind of an identity category, we need to stop treating it as like just a quick snip. Because the snip itself might be quick, but the impact on the identity of the person and even how they're identified by others is profound.
How can we think about the relationship between the ways we talk about circumcision and the ways that it really seems to impart identity, as you and Ellie were just saying, and maybe sort of broader social forces around masculinities? And this is something that comes up in Jewish law, not asking you to comment on that, but just kind of in society and your research. I think it could be really helpful for thinking through these questions in secular society and maybe religious questions as well.
Well, it definitely is implicated in questions of masculinity, right? It's almost like one of the first gendering moments. You're cut or you're uncut. And so how do we think that one through? And what does it mean if you are cut in an uncut society or uncut in a cut society, right? And this is where you get to these like debates amongst parents about the locker room. That's going to be a scary space for our son if his penis looks weird. I don't know how many people are in locker rooms anymore, but everything I've read is suggesting that this is not really what's happening in the locker rooms. There was an article recently around the decline of nakedness in locker rooms, so people like kind of hiding themselves and these sorts of things. So I think the thing is we put a lot of emphasis on it and imagine all kinds of possible scenarios that might affect the boy when he becomes a man.
Right, and you capture this with the term of foreskin fantasies, right?
Yes. And I mean, the foreskin fantasies are the stories that we sort of tell ourselves when we decide to circumcise or not our child. And so it's usually you need to convince yourself to do something, I suppose. But parents talked so many pregnancy manuals, and I've got so many of them now. Everyone around here must think I'm always having children or something. Like they go to great pains to talk about this issue, and then they speak about all the possible things. Like he might be teased, he might not look like his brother, or he might not look like his cousins, or what if a future partner doesn't like it, or all of these sorts of things. And you start to like go, oh, jeepers, I gotta prevent this potential bullying in the future. And so you try to make the right decision. But what's missing from that is, for instance, declining circumcision rates. So if you're making a decision based on your current status, well, if you were born in the 80s, circumcision rates were much higher than they are right now. So what was normal in the 80s is not what's normal in the 2020s.
And you really hone in on this fear and fantasy axis. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because one of the things that I found so refreshing about your book is that you decided not to just leave it as a justification, but to really dig into the justification. What is going on here? Why is the penis becoming the site of fears and fantasies for parents?
That's such an interesting and such a big question, because it is really confusing in a lot of ways how much meaning is put into this, into the penis, right? And I mean, of course, our culture, the phallus has always been important, it seems. But what's so interesting is just that it's become also like an aesthetic concern, a sexual concern. The child is like hours old, days old when this is happening. And so we have to create, I think they're kind of fantasies about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and trying to avoid potential problems in the future. And the reality is you can't really control the future as much as we might try. And so parents who are confused or who are uncertain what to do, the information is just overwhelming and entirely uncertain. And it's not helpful in a lot of ways because you don't know what to do. So if you're a secular parent, you're not doing this for covenantal or religious reasons, and you want to make a decision, and you want to make an informed decision, and you look at pregnancy manuals, for instance, almost all of them come to the same conclusion. It's up to you. No, it's not up to me. I need some advice. You're a doctor. Tell me. Or you go online and you get very polarizing opinions. And those can be confusing too, and convincing. So what do you do? That's a tough one. And so I think this is where the fears really start to percolate. What if I make the wrong decision? What if it is healthier than not, right? Or what if he will be bullied? Like, all of those are real questions.
This is such an interesting point that you're making here. And I think it's something that we don't think about enough when we talk about the kind of cultural norm in the United States of parental choice, right? This is a norm that has been reinforced by organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics when they come out with their very carefully worded statements where they don't want to bias the decision one way or the other. And like you're saying, in these pregnancy manuals where it's all about the parental choice. And in a way, it comes back to like a very like central liberal idea, which is there should be autonomy here. A choice should be made. But of course, it's not the choice of the person being circumcised. It's the choice of the parents that's being emphasized. And in a weird way, that, as you're saying, does end up amplifying these fears and fantasies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because at some point, you're going to have to explain to your child, this is what I did and why I did it. And what if they're not happy with the decision? That's a tough one, right? And I suppose if you didn't circumcise them, they could opt into circumcision. But if you did have them circumcised, you can't really reattach it.
Yeah, no, I was also so interested by your discussion of how such a consistent theme in pregnancy and parenting books is the parental choice here, rather than, for example, taking the foreskin as a given or something like that. And yeah, I mean, I was thinking also, one thing that we hear a lot in conversations about circumcision is folks saying something like, well, if, parents make all kinds of choices for their kids, right? And this isn't really that different. I wonder how you might respond to that sort of line of thinking, right? Like, what is distinct and sort of notable about circumcision and the framing of it as a choice that might not apply to other kinds of ways of thinking about parental choice in the context of children?
Well, this is an interesting one because it shows just how complicated this issue is, right? Which we often seem to treat as trivial. If you're doing the circumcision to look like dad, that's an aesthetic choice, for instance. Maybe it's a kinship choice. So that one is more about you and your interests in a lot of ways. If you're doing it for health reasons, right, that you believe that it's healthier, then it gets into this, we make lots of health-based decisions for our children. And so one of the things I've seen in critiques of anti-circumcision movements is that some people say, well, that's like anti-vaccines because it's a denial of apparently a beneficial procedure for health-related reasons. So the question there about parental rights or children, their rights, it gets complicated when you think about, well, what are the reasons for the procedure? If they are purely aesthetic, I mean, if I have a tattoo, do I get my kid tattooed? No, probably not, right? And so maybe there we can say, well, let's hold off. If you believe that there's genuine health benefits and you are convinced by that literature, I think that's a different reason for circumcising, which you might be doing for the good of the child in your mind, right?
Let's talk a little bit about aesthetics. Another thing that I really appreciated about your book is that you gave aesthetics room to breathe. Usually it's sort of relegated in these conversations to like an afterthought of like, oh, how funny. They think it looks better, blah, blah, blah. But no, you said you argue for the primacy of taking aesthetics seriously and that this plays an outsized role in the cultural significance of the foreskin and of circumcision. Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. Because I mean, when we think about foreskin jokes, it's often about aesthetics, right? The idea that he looks like a Shar-Pei, or he has an anteater, or it's ugly, or all of these sorts of things, right? Those are not health-based concerns. Those are not policy-driven. Those are aesthetic concerns. So when we say the foreskin's ugly, okay, where does that idea come from? If we look at, and I talk about this in the book, like some of the paragons of male beauty, Michelangelo's David, totally uncut, right? I know that some people want to debate it and say, well, maybe he had a little bit trimmed off the front, recognizing that circumcision practices have changed over time. That seems a bit of a stretch to me. He, for all intents and purposes, to a modern eye, he's uncut. So I'm curious about that. Well, how can we say that this man is like this example of male beauty when he's got this uncut penis, right? And if we look at the history of art, like if you go to sculptures, try and find a circumcised one.
I need to jump in here about Michelangelo's David, because this is something that has driven me bananas for a very, very long time. You have to deny the evidence of your eyes to come to the conclusion that this statue is in any way circumcised, is clearly intact.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
And then you get into these weird conversations about, well, maybe it was the earlier form of circumcision. And then these people don't know the history very well or biblical scholarship very well. And they end up being off in their judgments by about 500 years about when things happened. But like, no, he's clearly intact. For the record, Michelangelo's David is clearly intact, and it's obvious that Michelangelo was not a Bible scholar. He did it because he thought it was beautiful. End of story. This debate is stupid. End of story.
No, I completely agree. And I mean, if you look at the David closely, that's not just a foreskin. That's a lengthy foreskin in a sense, right? It hangs over the glands.
Yeah, so, one that the Greeks would have liked.
Yeah, I mean, it's not it takes a lot of like squinting to get to a circumcised penis there.
I want to use Michelangelo was not a Bible scholar in all our trailers, Ellie.
So, okay. I want to bring this back also, though, because in addition to arguing for the importance of aesthetics in this conversation, you also make a different move, which I think was fascinating. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about it. You argue that not only are aesthetics important in the conversation, but actually it's a way out of the logjam of the polarized nature of the conversation. You argue that aesthetics should be the way to talk about this if we're interested in seeing less circumcision, right?
Oh, well, I think one of the things that is so striking about so much of the polarizing narrative is the things that it misses, in a sense, or it tries to avoid. And I don't want to say I'm tired of the debates, but it sort of feels like a tennis match, right? I publish something, then I get the rebuttal, and then there's a rebuttal to the rebuttal, and we go back and forth, right? And so we're not actually moving the debate in any real direction. We're sort of at a stalemate. So I want to just change the frames of the debate. So, okay, let's talk about aesthetics. Let's actually think about questions of beauty or questions of ugliness. Let's also disrupt the assumption that the cut penis is somehow more aesthetically pleasing, as if they're all the same. Not all circumcisions are the same. There are circumcision accidents, right? There are circumcision scars. There's the two-toned pigmentation. There are skin bridges. There are all sorts of things that can happen and do go wrong with circumcisions too, right? And those are aesthetic choices as well that result in aesthetic difference. I think turning to aesthetics is interesting.
Yeah, and in terms of thinking about reclaiming the foreskin aesthetically, so you talk a bit about some modern photography, you talk also about some pornographic magazines. Can you talk a bit about some of the ways that the foreskin has already been started to be reclaimed aesthetically in culture, and maybe ways that it might be more so in the future?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the thing is just calling attention to it more than anything, right? It's not abnormal. It's actually found on quite a number of penises, and by just reframing our debate to say like, well, wait a minute, foreskins are everywhere. They are globally present. They are interesting, right? I mean, there are certainly magazines devoted to the foreskin. There was in the 80s and 90s Foreskin Quarterly, a men's magazine that originally was for readers interested in circumcision debates, but very quickly became a gay male magazine. Then there's also Uncut, another gay male magazine, which featured uncut penises. So they called attention to what they thought of as the beautifulness of the foreskin. And they made, in many ways, aesthetic arguments, maybe not explicitly, but certainly implicitly, by showcasing the uncut penis in the world of pornography, where at the time it was relatively rare.
I have to mention here, as a visual artist who has made work about this subject, one of the considerations that I took very seriously when I was making my film Cut was, how am I going to show the circumcised and uncircumcised and restored penises in the film? And I was very, very aware that having explicit images of these penises side by side in my film was going to limit the reach. I was not going to be able to show it on certain television stations, but I felt really like what you're talking about now, about the importance of aesthetics, I kind of like felt intuitively while I was making the film. And I just like, one of the most powerful moments in my film, I think, is when I put a circumcised and an intact penis side by side on the screen. And you can really, having given people the information, you can see that one has scar tissue from the site of the circumcision scar all the way down to the end of the penis, including the glands. It's all scar tissue. And you see it next to a very healthy looking intact penis where the foreskin is retracted. And it's just like, it was one of these moments that I felt was really powerful in the film. Again, limited where the film could go, but it was so important to me because there's something about, looking at a penis that for your whole life you would have considered the normal penis, and understanding that from like an objective perspective, when you put it side by side with a natural penis, there's something that has been damaged here that just like on a visual, emotional level, it was very important to me.
Absolutely. And honestly, in a strange way, we need to see these images. What happens so often in books, like especially like pregnancy manuals, but also books on puberty, like those books that you get when you're like, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old and your body's changing. What's happening? You get a cartoon penis. That's not the same. Like visually, it's not the same. Viscerally, it's not the same. The glans penis of a circumcised penis versus an uncircumcised penis, very different. Moisture, different. All of that, right? So if we don't actually see the thing, it's hard to conceptualize it. So I think it's important to see that. I'm not saying put dicks everywhere, but like let's be honest and truthful about these things.
Yeah. But at least put dicks in a film about circumcision, maybe.
Absolutely.
Well, and to, the sort of extreme of this, right? You referenced the example of Patrick Stewart, which I wasn't familiar with, but just like not even being quite sure if he was circumcised.
I love that story.
You had an extraordinary disagreement with your wife about yourself. Do you know what I'm talking about?
By myself, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Ooh.
Listen, I do know this story.
I do not know
Listen
this
with
story.
interest.
One night, as you do, we were talking about stuff, and I just had no interest, and of course, being circumcised, I said...
They were chatting, they're married, they're allowed.
And she said, "You're not circumcised." I said, "What do you mean? You've only known me all my life." I remember my mother telling me. Why? Because it was fashionable at the time. She said, "You're not circumcised." I said, "That's ridiculous. I should know if I'm circumcised." Of course I am. End of conversation. But the next day, I happened to be seeing my doctor. Are you okay? I was seeing my doctor for my annual physical.
Of course.
So while he was down there, I said,
Excuse me,
oh, by the way, Irv, my wife and I had a little disagreement. I am circumcised, aren't I? Because she says I'm not. And he goes, not. I said, no, it's not possible. So he looked down again and he said, hey, I'm Jewish. I know the difference.
Yeah, which is wild. I wasn't familiar. It's just an example of like, when there's, kind of cultural lack of knowledge, this can play out on an individual level as well in really puzzling ways.
Well, imagine the potential like health problems if you didn't know. Patrick Stewart, that's fine. He's I don't know, 75 years old when he told that story. But that is important to know, right? Do you have a foreskin? Yes or no? Are you circumcised? Yes or no? Those are often intake forms when you go to a urologist, for instance. Or
let's talk about the foreskin and sexuality. Let's talk about the debates back and forth about, is sexual experience with a foreskin different than it is without a foreskin? You seem to be very interested in this question and also not come to an obvious conclusion in the book. So talk about the process and what do you think about this?
So one of the things that you find in the scholarship often is that the argument is that there's no real sensational difference. A circumcised penis, uncircumcised penis, they both have sex the same. They both feel the same, all of this sort of stuff. Because it's about deflating parents' worries in a lot of ways. So you'll find this in the pregnancy manuals too, that, it's this. And so I thought, okay, well, that's interesting, but they're different. Like, they just are different. The intact penis as a foreskin that glides over the glans penis, right? There's a sensational difference. It's like putting on a sock or something. You feel the sock going on. So I was sort of fascinated by this. Like, why are we so invested in saying they're the same? Why is that? Like, why couldn't they be different? They experience things differently. Okay. It's not that one's better or worse. It's that they're different. So as I was doing this, I started looking at sex manuals and I thought, well, how do they describe it? And there is a fundamental difference, an absolute difference, where so many sex manuals are talking about the foreskin advantage or the friendly foreskin, or so much so that some, especially the American sex manuals, teach their readers how to help their partner experience a faux foreskin, right? Like, you can give him the sensation of a foreskin without him having one by wrapping a scarf or something, like just really strange things. So clearly the sex manuals think there's a difference, right? Which is for the people having sex. The scientific literature seems less convinced. So how do we square this? How do we make sense of this? Like, if I'm a parent, I've probably read a sex manual, right? Well, it said there is a difference. Now, this pregnancy book saying there isn't a difference. And most likely your partner wouldn't be able to tell you if there was a difference or not, because they would have been circumcised most likely as a child or as a neonate. So it's one of these things that we don't really have a lot of data on comparing the two, if you will. What's interesting, and I haven't written on this, is that there are anecdotal reports of men who did seek circumcision later in life, and they compare and contrast their sex lives. The challenge, of course, is I don't know how accurate they are in a sense, because they appear usually in magazine formats, but they all seem to say that there is a difference too. The one says, like, I'm not as sensitive, so I don't ejaculate as quickly. I feel less, but he saw that as an advantage, not a disadvantage. So there are like bits and pieces of information out there. We definitely need more, because it does seem that there is. And I think if you think about the mechanics of it, it does seem that there should be some sort of sensational difference.
Yeah, I interviewed one of these people in my film who had it done as an adult.
I had it done late in life. I was about 27. Yeah. And it was done mostly for health reasons. I probably should have looked into it a little bit harder. I got more than 3 different people's opinions on it. One was my doctor, but still, it's just I don't think the health risk is that major.
Was your doctor encouraging you to do it?
He was pretty much middle of the road. I mean, I told him what I wanted to have done, and he told me why, what would be beneficial about it. The funny thing is, he never once, and I think it's a pretty important thing. Never once mentioned the loss of sensitivity. I regret having it done, actually. It's one of those things in life that you can't go back and change, unfortunately. I lost so much sensitivity because of it. I had no idea how much sensitivity I would lose. And that as I get older now, it actually makes it harder to maintain erections because that sensitivity is not there. I mean, but it's like being outside on a sunny day and not being able to feel the heat or the grass under your feet or anything. To me, it's being in a good place and just not getting all the good sensations that you can from it.
So there are two things that are going on here simultaneously, I think. I think on the one hand, you have a very difficult thing to quantify, which is if you in good faith wanted to go about quantifying a difference in sexual pleasure between someone with a foreskin and someone without a foreskin, it's difficult to do it. It's almost impossible to find enough of people who have had both experiences themselves. And then, so there's just let's call them methodological challenges to actually arriving at a conclusion. But then I think something you put your finger on in the book, and I think is absolutely true, is there seem to be other concerns of the researchers other than just a good faith attempt to figure out what is the truth here. I think there's this sensitivity that they have, and it's coming from a good place. It's coming from, we don't want circumcised men to feel like they're missing out. Mm. But that has no place in scientific research. That should not be guiding decision-making about how you're putting together a study or how you're reporting on results of a study. That's just not, but that is present all over the literature, in addition to some just obvious methodological mistakes. If you look at the Masters and Johnson study, for example, you find that they're comparing sites on the penis that exist in the circumcised and the intact male both. So they're looking at sensitivity of the glands, but they completely forget to look at the sensitivity of the foreskin, which is isn't that the thing that we're talking about here?
Yeah.
So to me, it's two layers. There's the challenge, the methodological challenges of even coming up with a good study design. And then there are these sort of well-motivated, but completely confounding desires to not offend, the circumcised public.
Absolutely. And I kind of want to say, well, what's the harm in telling us that there might be a sensational difference? It's not saying that one's better or worse. It's saying that, yes, there's a difference. And that's fair, right? I mean, there's an aesthetic difference. It looks different. We use that as a logic, right? So to me, it feels like I want to know more about why we're so invested in saying they're the same. They're not.
And that's part of the problem, right? That it's so hard to avoid translating any difference into a better or worse comparison. And as you were saying with sex manuals, that, they're kind of talking about this pleasure advantage, but maybe what the pleasure advantage is in this case is just extra possibilities or something like that. So maybe even what they're talking about there could be reframed as not necessarily a better or worse, but it's quite difficult. And I mean, I totally agree that being able to talk about different kinds of experiences of different folks is really helpful. And I think that your idea of fantasy and that one can only imagine what it would be like to have a different circumcision status is actually really helpful for resisting these kinds of better worse comparisons.
Oh, absolutely. It's the same as, one could imagine what it's like to have, a much bigger penis, right? Or a smaller penis, right? These sorts of things. We can have all sorts of fantasies about these.
Let's talk a little bit about foreskin restoration. You devote quite a bit of the book to talking and thinking about the phenomena of restoring the foreskin. And I think you correctly point out that there's a history of this practice that goes back to the ancient world that hasn't really been written yet. But you also think about foreskin restoration through some Freudian concepts. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think the thing about foreskin restoration is it's something we don't know a lot about. We hear about it sometimes if we get into this sort of research. And so the first thing I wanted to do was say, this is not brand new. We need to know that, right? It's as old as the Bible, right? And I think Sandra Gilman says it's one of the first aesthetic surgeries, decircumcision. So that's important. Right? Let's not pretend that this is some sort of internet fad. This has a history. And it has a history for a variety of reasons. And I would very much like to see a book on that history. And what I wanted to do was think about what it means to actually start the process of restoring. For one, it's not easy. It's not quick, right? This is often months, years of work. And so people who do this, who undertake this, are committing a lot of time to this. It's important to them. This is not like going and getting your ears pierced or something. It's arduous. You are often very isolated because it's not like there's a club of men you can go to at your local, YMCA or something. And it's kind of word of mouth, right? You learn from other folks who have done this. And so I wanted to think about that and sort of say, like, there's something happening here. There's something serious. There's something genuine. And I wanted to think through what that means. And so the idea of like missing out comes up in this section too, right? Which is you were circumcised against your will. You're not happy with that decision. And you realize that you are missing out on something you once had. And so you try to reclaim it. Now, we might call that a kind of penis envy, to borrow Freud's term, right? And there probably is some envy there. I don't think it's the same as Freud means it, but I do think it's sort of the recognition that something was done to me that I didn't consent to, I didn't ask for, and I'm not happy with it. And unlike other things, there's not an easy fix to this. If you go to doctors and ask them about foreskin restoration, like I have studies that say that they were laughed out of the room. So it's also about taking these patients, these men, seriously.
Yeah, I mean, in my research on this, I actually do think there are places where people go, not quite as accessible as the local YMCA, but there's a group called NORM, the National Organization of Restoring Men.
Yeah. But
my sense from talking to these people, I got two sort of big trends. The first was I got to a certain age. This was very consistent along all the restoring men that I spoke to. I got to a certain age and I started feeling less sensation for my penis. Mm-hmm. And I was looking for a way to get that sensation back.
Yeah.
So in an interesting way, that's comparing self to self, not so much self to other in a penis envy kind of a way. And the other thing I got was very much, this is a political statement of something was taken away from me. I didn't have a choice in the matter, and I'm going to do something to get that part of my body back, even if it means engaging in a 2 to 4 year process of stretching that's going to be very uncomfortable and very inconvenient. So those were sort of the two things that kind of popped out to me when I was talking to these folks. I'm wondering if we can transition to a conversation about the intactivist movement and what your impressions are of it.
So I'm currently researching the intactivist movement. So this is an interesting space to think about this. What interests me about intactivism right now is its history. I'm not a historian. I probably should have been.
I mean, you kind of are.
One of the things about intactivism is it very quickly in the literature gets described as kind of like a mostly online movement, as if it's just online. But intactivism's history is much larger than that. So if we think to the 80s, right, we have Marilyn Milos, right, writing her recent memoir just came out, which is great. And she tells the story of how she came to this realization that circumcision was a problem. In the 1970s, I've documented this elsewhere. I found articles in Hustler magazine, of all places, speaking about not being for circumcision, actually being against it. It's called The First Ripoff, I think, in the Hustler article. And then even in a magazine like Sexology, which was kind of a Reader's Digest about sexual health, I trace it from like the 30s to the 70s, that there are these debates going on and sort of anti-circumcision arguments. So one of the things that interests me is that history is to say, like, wait a minute, this is not just an online movement. This has a much larger history, and it's very nuanced. It has morphed in various ways to various concerns. For some, intactivism is still just about the penis. For others, it's about the rights of all neonates and all children to have genital autonomy. And so we need to understand just how diverse and how complex that movement is, and that it's not a sort of monolith. There's a lot of discussions happening there. Like intactivism sometimes intersects with foreskin restoration, but not always. People who restore their foreskin sometimes are intactivists, sometimes they're not. And for me, what is so interesting about it is just how the movement has grown the internet maybe facilitated some recognition amongst members of the movement, but there were circumcision clearinghouses and information centers, and people were speaking about circumcision at parenting meetings or, town halls, letters to the editor. This is a part of responding to, in many ways, a culture that circumcised the vast majority of boys.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to say, of course, about the activist movement, and I'm really looking forward to your further research on this. So one question which I have that maybe you can shed some light on is about some of the ways that a lot of the current activist movements are pretty confrontational in many cases, and in terms of like confronting medical establishments and doctors, as well as and kind of you mentioned that some of the that some of the prominent images of activists are protest photographs, right? Which is, really helps in showing that the movement is not just online, but those are kind of, part of this confrontational stance. And I'm not trying to say that all activism is necessarily like this, but I'm wondering, about ways that you might see some of the tactics and sort of like orientation to society in the current activist movement reflected in some of the history and culture that you've looked at around the foreskin.
Well, I think one of the challenges with the confrontational thing is you almost immediately set people don't. I don't think people like confrontation. Maybe I'm naive. To me, that's not going to be as helpful as a friendly conversation of trying to understand one another's perspectives. And so, yeah, you do get some activist groups that will protest at, a medical association meeting, and they're bringing attention to their issue. But I'm curious to know what the doctors at that medical association meeting think about their presence at this. Like, are they convinced by it? Do they go out and seek the information that the group is trying to provide? Or should we take other approaches? There's the sort of soft activism that can happen online. There's ways to engage in thoughtful debate and discussion that I think can be very helpful. And I think for me, this is why I'm sort of so interested in moving away from the cut-uncut debate and just sort of reframing it and saying like, well, the foreskin's kind of cool.
Jonathan Allan, you're not a historian. And thank you so much for coming on the Bruchim podcast and sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you for your wonderful book.
Thank you.
What are you up to? Where can people find your work?
I think everything's available through most bookstores. But you can find me at brandonuniversity.ca.
Next time on the Bruchim podcast. So this episode, what we wanted to do was sort of look back at this season that we had and do a little, metabolism, right? We had some pretty high level, interesting conversations, lots of really interesting ideas. And we thought it would be useful both for us, but also for our audience, for you, dear listener, to do a little digestion of what took place over this past season. Right, Max?
Yeah, no, for sure. And, I think there's a lot of threads here that we're going to continue exploring in many ways in the future, and that connected also to season 1. And, we'll talk a lot about some of these interesting threads, but also we'd love to hear from you, our listeners about what really stuck out to you from this season as well.
Thank you for listening to the Bruchim podcast. If you like what you've heard here, you may also like our YouTube series, Circumcision Texts in the Jewish Tradition, where Max and I are studying all of the major circumcision texts in chronological order. If you find value in this content, please consider supporting our organization at bruchim.online. That's BRUCHIM.online. We're a 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to email us at info@bruchim.online. Lehitraot.